The rain poured relentlessly, the sound of it tapping against the window pane, a constant, rhythmic beat that seemed to match the pacing of her thoughts. Abigail had never been particularly superstitious, but something about the weather tonight felt different, as though the storm itself was trying to warn her about something. She sat at the kitchen table, sipping her lukewarm coffee, the mug feeling oddly heavy in her hands. The silence in the house was profound, almost suffocating, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. She had just come back from a walk that had felt more like a journey through a foggy dream than reality. The street was eerily empty, the houses lined up in neat rows, all of them shrouded in an unnatural stillness. Abigail had lived in this town her entire life, and yet today, something seemed off. The faces she passed by didn't seem familiar, even though she was certain she had seen them before. She didn't know why, but she felt an unshakable sense of unease, as though the world around her was suddenly unfamiliar, slipping out of her grasp. Abigail stood up from the table and walked to the window, her breath fogging the glass as she peered out into the darkened street. She had always been the type of person who enjoyed solitude, but today, the quiet felt wrong. There was a disconnect, a fracture in the normalcy of her life that she couldn't explain. It was as if time had been distorted, as though a whole day had slipped through her fingers, without her even realizing it. She hadn't noticed it at first, but the realization hit her like a sudden chill. There was a day just a few days ago that she couldn't remember. It wasn't that she had forgotten it. It was as though it had never happened at all. The thought was unsettling, and she felt a deep, gnawing feeling in the pit of her stomach, like something was lurking just beyond the edge of her memory, waiting to be discovered. She tried to shake off the discomfort and decided to focus on something productive. Her eyes wandered to the bookshelf against the wall, where a collection of journals and notebooks sat in neat rows. She had always kept a diary, a habit that helped her organize her thoughts and keep track of her life. Maybe writing would bring some clarity, help her piece together the day that seemed to have vanished from her mind. Abigail walked over to the shelf and pulled down a leather-bound journal, its cover worn with age. She flipped through the pages, her fingers grazing the familiar ink, the neat, looping handwriting that she had always recognized as her own. But as she turned the pages, something caught her eye. One particular entry stood out, an entry from the day she couldn't remember. The date was marked clearly at the top, but the words that followed were like nothing she had ever written before. The handwriting was hers, but the language was foreign, strange symbols and characters that didn't belong in any language she knew. She blinked, her heart pounding in her chest. How could this be? She didn't recognize the script, yet there it was, on a page she knew she had written. She tried to make sense of it, flipping through the pages of the journal. But no matter how hard she tried, the words made no sense. The language was impossible to decipher, a twisted collection of symbols that felt more like a code than anything resembling a real language. She could feel her pulse quickening as the room seemed to close in around her. Something wasn't right. As Abigail stared at the page, she felt a strange pull, an almost magnetic force drawing her in. It was as if the words themselves were reaching out to her, whispering something just beyond her understanding. She ran her fingers over the ink, trying to make sense of it. But the more she looked, the more the letters seemed to shift and change, like they were alive, like they were mocking her inability to understand them. Her mind raced, searching for an explanation. Had she been sleepwalking? Was she losing her mind? She had always prided herself on her sharp memory, her ability to keep track of the smallest details. Yet, here she was, staring at a page in her own handwriting, filled with words that seemed to come from another world entirely. The storm outside seemed to grow louder, the wind howling as if it too were aware of the unnaturalness of the moment. Abigail felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end, a chill creeping down her spine. She needed to understand what had happened, needed to make sense of the day she couldn't remember. But the more she tried to focus on the page, the more her thoughts began to spiral, like she was losing control of her own mind. She slammed the journal shut, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The room felt too small, the air too thick. She needed to get out, to clear her head. With trembling hands, she pushed the journal back onto the shelf and made her way to the door, stepping out into the cold night air. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained a dark, oppressive blanket, the moon barely visible through the clouds. She walked through the empty streets, trying to make sense of what had happened. The further she went, the more the town seemed to distort, as if the buildings were shifting, the streets twisting into unfamiliar paths. It was like she was caught in a dream, a nightmare that she couldn't wake up from. Every step she took felt like it led her further into a world that wasn't her own, a world that seemed to be closing in on her from all sides. By the time she reached the park, she felt dizzy, her mind spinning with confusion and fear. She sat down on a bench, trying to steady her breath, trying to force herself to think. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Her mind kept returning to that page in the journal, the foreign language she couldn't understand, and the growing sense of dread that had been building inside her ever since she had realized the day had disappeared. It wasn't just the memory of the day that was missing. It was as if that day had been erased entirely, as though it had never existed in the first place. The thought of it made her stomach twist with anxiety. What had happened that day? Why couldn't she remember it? And why was her own handwriting so wrong? Her phone buzzed in her pocket, jolting her out of her thoughts. She pulled it out, her hands still shaking, and saw a message from her best friend, Rachel. It was a simple text. "You okay? I've been trying to reach you all day. All day." The words echoed in her mind, a knife twisting in her gut. Rachel had been trying to reach her all day, but Abigail hadn't heard from her. She hadn't even known it was supposed to be a day to remember. The feeling of unease deepened and a thought crossed her mind, one that she tried to dismiss as impossible. What if she hadn't been the only one who had forgotten? What if the day had been erased for everyone? She pulled up her messages with Rachel, scrolling through them. But as she looked, something caught her eye. A message from the day she couldn't remember. It was a single sentence, sent late at night. It read, "You weren't supposed to remember." Abigail's breath caught in her throat. She felt the ground beneath her feet shift, the world tilting as the full weight of what she was reading hit her. The message was from herself. It was a message from a version of herself that she didn't recognize, a version of her that knew something she didn't. The cold grip of fear tightened around her heart, and she stood up, stumbling as she tried to make sense of what was happening. The world around her felt distant, like it was being pulled away, and a voice, soft and insidious, whispered from the shadows, "You weren't supposed to remember." The sound of her own name, her own voice, echoed through her mind, but there was no one around to speak it. The realization crashed over her like a tidal wave. Something had happened to her, something that had erased an entire day from her memory. Something had manipulated her perception, and now, as the truth began to surface, she was no longer sure if she could trust her own mind. The darkness seemed to grow thicker, and Abigail felt herself being pulled into its depths, like she was falling into a place where the rules of reality no longer applied. And as she stood there paralyzed by fear, she understood one terrifying truth. She wasn't supposed to remember, and now it was too late. Abigail didn't sleep that night. The hours passed in a haze of restless thoughts, the message from Rachel replaying in her mind over and over again. You weren't supposed to remember. Each time the words echoed, they seemed to take on a deeper meaning, a more sinister tone. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that something or someone was lurking just beyond her reach, waiting for her to figure it out. The next morning, Abigail woke with a start, the eerie silence of her room pressing in on her. She had been drifting in and out of uneasy dreams, but nothing had been able to erase the memory of the message she'd received. Her phone still sat on her bedside table, the screen locked, as if mocking her, as if reminding her that she had yet to understand what was happening. Her heart pounded in her chest as she reached for it, unlocking the screen with trembling fingers. The message was still there, the one that sent a chill through her bones. You weren't supposed to remember. She stared at it for a long moment, wondering if it was real, if it had really come from her. Her mind was clouded, and she didn't know what to believe anymore. She scrolled through the rest of her messages from Rachel, but there was nothing that stood out. The conversation seemed normal enough. She'd been talking to Rachel earlier in the week, and there had been nothing odd about their interactions. But that single message lingered, too real, too terrifying to ignore. Abigail stood up and walked over to her bookshelf again, her fingers brushing against the worn leather of the journal she had picked up the previous night. She had shoved it back onto the shelf in haste after reading the strange entry, but now it seemed like the only link to the answers she was desperately seeking. She took it down, opened it again to the same page, and stared at the foreign script. The symbols twisted in front of her eyes, flickering and shifting like a mirage. Her eyes burned from trying to focus on the words, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't make sense of it. Her fingers lingered over the page, feeling the texture of the paper, the weight of it in her hands. Something about it felt different today, as if the journal was speaking to her, beckoning her to understand its secrets. It was as though the words were alive, waiting to be unraveled. With a frustrated sigh, Abigail slammed the journal shut and stood up, pacing the room. She needed answers. She needed to understand what was going on. It was as if her whole life had shifted overnight, leaving her with more questions than she could possibly answer. And the more she tried to put the pieces together, the more it seemed like everything was slipping through her fingers. The days that followed were a blur. Abigail found herself going through the motions, her thoughts constantly drifting back to the strange events that had begun to unfold around her. She still couldn't shake the sensation that she was being watched. The silence in her home had become oppressive, suffocating, and no matter where she went, she felt the presence of something, someone, just out of sight, waiting for her to make a move. One afternoon, Abigail decided to go through her phone, searching for anything that might help her make sense of the situation. She combed through old photos, old messages, even social media posts, hoping to find something that could explain the inexplicable. That was when she stumbled upon a photo from the day she couldn't remember. It was a selfie, taken outside a cafe she frequented. She was smiling, her face lit up by the sunlight, but something in the background caught her attention. The figure of a man standing just behind her, with a dark expression on his face. Abigail's stomach churned. She didn't recognize him. In fact, she didn't even remember being at that cafe at all. She stared at the photo for a long time, trying to recall the moment it was taken, but the memory was completely absent. The day had slipped away from her, leaving behind only this haunting image, like a fragment of something that didn't belong. Suddenly, the realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The man in the photo. He was the same person she had seen the night she received the message. She had thought it was just a trick of her mind, the shadows playing tricks on her. But now, she was sure. He had been there, in her room, watching her. She backed away from the photo, feeling the cold sweat bead on her skin. The world around her seemed to close in, the walls narrowing, the air thick and suffocating. She needed to get out, to escape whatever it was that was following her. But where could she go? There was no escape from the grip of this growing terror. She was trapped, and the more she searched for answers, the deeper she fell into a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Her phone buzzed again, snapping her out of her thoughts. She picked it up, and this time, it was a message from Rachel. Her fingers hesitated over the screen before she opened it. "I'm sorry, Abigail. I didn't want to tell you this, but you need to know. You weren't supposed to remember, none of us were. It wasn't just you. We've all forgotten. But some of us started remembering. And now, it's too late." Abigail's breath hitched as she read the words. Rachel's message confirmed her worst fear. She wasn't the only one who had experienced the strange erasure of time. The entire day had been wiped from their memories, but fragments were beginning to resurface, and it was no coincidence. It was all connected to something much larger, something that they had all unknowingly been a part of. The phone slipped from her fingers, falling onto the floor with a soft thud. Abigail sank to her knees, her mind reeling. What did this mean? What had happened that day? And why were they all so desperate to forget? She looked around the room, her gaze falling on the journal again. The foreign language, the messages, the man in the photo. It was all tied together, and Abigail felt the dark tendrils of dread wrapping around her heart. She couldn't escape it. She couldn't ignore it any longer. That night, as she lay in bed, Abigail's mind raced. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion, each one leading her down a new path, a new possibility. But no matter where she went, she always ended up at the same terrifying conclusion. There was something she wasn't meant to remember. The house was quiet, too quiet, and the air felt heavy, thick with the weight of unspoken truths. Abigail stared up at the ceiling, her mind still swirling with the mystery. She was so exhausted, but sleep would not come. The sensation of being watched was stronger than ever, as though eyes were on her from every corner of the room. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she pulled the covers tighter around herself, trying to find comfort in the familiar. Then, just as she was about to drift off, she heard it, a whisper. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, clearer. "You weren't supposed to remember." The words echoed through the room, chilling her to the bone. The voice wasn't hers, but it was so close, as though the speaker was standing right next to her. Abigail's heart pounded in her chest as she turned her head, searching the darkness for any sign of movement. The room was empty, the shadows stretching across the walls like tendrils of darkness. But the voice persisted. "You weren't supposed to remember," it repeated, growing louder, more insistent. Abigail's breath hitched as she sat up, her eyes wide with terror. The voice seemed to come from all around her, from every corner, from the very walls themselves. It was as though something was reaching out to her, pulling her deeper into the mystery that she had no choice but to unravel. The fear was overwhelming now, consuming her, as she realized the horrifying truth. She had remembered too much, and there was no turning back. The room around Abigail seemed to spin. The whisper still echoed in her ears, each word sharper than the last, reverberating through her skull like a drumbeat, relentless and deafening. "You weren't supposed to remember." The voice was not just in the room, it was in her mind, crawling through the spaces between her thoughts, threading itself through her consciousness, until there was nothing left of her own will but the echoes of it. Her fingers dug into the sheets, her nails biting into the fabric. As she tried to steady herself, the darkness pressed in around her, thick and suffocating. The walls seemed to stretch and distort, bending and warping like the world was made of wax, melting under the heat of some unseen force. She felt it, the pull, the cold grip on her chest that made it hard to breathe, as though she were being dragged down into a place beyond reason, beyond time. The world was crumbling, and there was no escape. But despite the terror, Abigail felt a strange clarity beginning to emerge from the chaos. The words, the whispers, were not just a warning. They were a call, a message, a reminder of something she had known once, long ago, but had forgotten. Something that was now resurfacing, like the shadow of a dream, slipping back into the waking world. She closed her eyes, letting the noise of the voice fade, focusing instead on the deep silence that followed. The quiet was thick now, heavier than before, suffused with a weight that pulled her into the depths. She could feel it, a presence, watching, waiting, just behind the veil. She wanted to run, wanted to scream, but something inside her told her that she needed to stay. She needed to face whatever this was, to finally understand why she was caught in this nightmare, why her memories had been stolen from her, why she was at the center of this darkness. Abigail stood up, the room swirling around her as she forced herself to move. Her legs were unsteady, but she didn't care. She walked toward the door, each step measured, her breath shallow but determined. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but she knew she had to find it. The answers, the truth, everything she had been searching for. It was all out there, hidden somewhere in the house, in the spaces between what she could see and what she could remember. Her heart pounded in her chest as she crossed the threshold of her bedroom. The hall stretched out before her, the shadows lingering at the edges of the dim light. She didn't know where she was going, but her feet seemed to move of their own accord, guided by an invisible force. It was like she was walking in a dream, or perhaps a memory, one she had once lived but could no longer recall. The house was eerily silent, too silent, the air thick with the smell of dust and decay. She moved past the living room, her gaze catching on the family pictures that lined the walls. Pictures she no longer recognized. Faces that should have been familiar, but weren't. The realization hit her hard, a crushing blow to her already fragile sense of self. She didn't know these people. Not really. They were strangers, like ghosts frozen in time, trapped in a version of her life that didn't belong to her anymore. The stairs loomed ahead, the wooden steps creaking beneath her weight as she ascended, each step feeling like 1,000 years. She reached the top of the stairs, and the hallway stretched out before her, narrow and dark. The door at the end of the hall, her father's study, stood ajar, a faint light spilling out from the crack. She could feel it, the pull. The answers were in there, waiting. Her hand trembled as she reached for the door, pushing it open slowly, silently. The room inside was unchanged. The old wooden desk was still there, piled high with papers. The bookshelves lined the walls, filled with dusty volumes that hadn't been touched in years. But something was different. Something felt off. There, on the desk, was the leather-bound journal, the one she had been reading, the one that had haunted her. It was open, as though waiting for her to find it. She walked toward it, her feet dragging as though the weight of the world were pressing down on her. She reached out and flipped open the pages, the familiar sight of her own handwriting staring back at her. But this time, there was no foreign script. The pages were filled with the language she recognized, the words she had written, the memories, the fragments, the events that had been stolen from her, all laid out before her eyes. She scanned the pages, each one revealing more of the truth. The entry from the day she couldn't remember. It wasn't just an ordinary day. It was the day she had unknowingly crossed a line that separated her from the world she had known and thrust her into something darker, something unnatural. A pact had been made that day, one she hadn't even realized was happening. Her life, her memories, had been altered, manipulated, erased, and the strange symbols, the foreign language, those were the keys, the signatures, the markers of a force beyond her understanding. The journal detailed the events of that day, a day that had never happened. Or had it? Abigail's head spun as she read, the words blurring into one another. She had made a choice to forget, to erase the truth, and in doing so she had sealed herself in this twisted version of reality, caught in a cycle of memory loss, each day fading into the next, until the truth could no longer be denied. The voice whispered again, closer now, like a breath against her ear. You weren't supposed to remember. But this time, the words felt different. They didn't sting with fear. They didn't make her tremble. Instead, they felt familiar, like an old friend reminding her of something long lost. Abigail closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. She understood now. The truth wasn't something to be feared. It wasn't something to be hidden away. It was a part of her, a part of everyone, and no matter how hard they tried to suppress it, it would always resurface. The memories, the choices, the darkness. It was all a part of the fabric of existence. And now, she was part of it too. She opened her eyes and looked at the journal one last time, the words now clear to her. She didn't need to run anymore. She didn't need to hide from the truth. She could embrace it. It was hers. The house around her seemed to breathe with a new life, the shadows lifting, the air clearing. The oppressive weight that had settled over her for so long began to lift, replaced by a strange sense of peace. The whispers faded, replaced by silence, real silence, not the kind that made her feel trapped, but the kind that made her feel free. She had faced the truth, and in doing so, she had freed herself from the chains that had bound her for so long. Abigail smiled, her heart light, her mind clear. The journey wasn't over. It would never be over. But she had found her way back to herself. The days she had lost, the memories she had forgotten, they were all part of her story. And now, she was ready to live it. As she turned to leave the room, the door creaked behind her. But this time, It wasn't a sound of warning. It was a sound of release, of something unlocking, something opening up. The house, the memories, everything that had held her captive. It was all behind her now. The path forward stretched out before her, waiting for her to take the first step. And she did. Abigail walked down the hallway into the sunlight that poured through the windows, and for the first time in a long time, she felt the warmth of it on her skin. The world outside had not changed, but she had. She was no longer afraid. She was no longer lost. And as she stepped into the unknown, she knew one thing for sure. She was finally free. The last whisper faded into the air, leaving only the echo of a long-forgotten truth. You were always supposed to remember.